Fellas, the UFC has a lot of prospects. A prospect is someone who's kind of on the rise, that has a lot of potential. People think they're going to be the next big thing in the UFC. And there's a lot of prospects in every weight class. So we're going to be going through every UFC weight class. And first of all, talking about the most underrated prospects. So the fighter that I think has a lot of potential, but isn't really getting the hype they deserve and isn't really getting the respect I think they deserve. And then the most overrated prospects. So the fighter that I think is getting a lot of hype and a lot of attention. But from what they've shown me, I don't really think they earn it. They've earned it. And I think their hype is more than their potential. And we'll start off with the heavyweight division. The biggest prospect I can really think of recently was Rebellis Despain, but he's already been fraud checked. And apart from that, it's kind of just these fat unranked heavyweights throwing it out there. But I'd say the most underrated prospect right now is probably Mick Parkin. I think Mick Parkin's an underrated prospect. No one's really talking about Mick Parkin without context of Tom Aspinall, and he trains at Tom Aspinall's gym. But I feel like as a fighter in himself, I think he's going to be staying in the rankings for quite some time. All the attention in the heavyweight division is on Shamil Gaziev and Waldo Cortez Acosta and Denise, and kind of Mick Parkin's in the background. He's become ranked. Not many people have paid attention to it, and they kind of just overlook him in the heavyweight division. He's 10-0 undefeated, is Mick Parkin. Came from the Contender Series, got a finish on the Contender Series, then won his next three, included a win over Mohammed Usman. And then in his most recent fight, knocked out Lucas Proseski in the first round at UFC 304 for another finish in the UFC. He's now in the rankings of the heavyweight division, top 15 ranked. And I think what impresses me about Mick Parkin is he's not just one of these heavyweights that's very one-dimensional. He's got a good chin, he's got good stamina, good striking, good grappling. He's pretty much alright everywhere the fight goes, which is quite unusual for the heavyweight division. And I think the only thing he lacks is athleticism. I think if you give Mick Parkin a little bit better conditioning, more athleticism, I think he could be a big thing in the UFC heavyweight division. Not saying he's going to be a champion or anything like that, but I think he ticks all the boxes for a heavyweight prospect. He's not really got any weaknesses apart from athleticism. He trains at the best heavyweight gym on earth with Tom Aspinall and a bunch of other big heavyweights from around the world. He's undefeated, 5-fight UFC winning streak, and he's more technical than a lot of the heavyweights are out there. So I'm going to say that Mick Parkin is probably the most underrated heavyweight prospect right now from what I've seen. He said he's got a big fight soon, maybe against Derek Lewis or Tati Wivaza. I'm hoping he can fight somebody like Tati Wivaza next anyway. So I'd say that Mick Parkin's the most underrated heavyweight prospect and the most overrated prospect in the heavyweight division. This might have died down now, but I'm going to say it's Denise. I think Denise was probably the most overrated prospect. He was a favourite going to that fight with Marcin Tybura, which I never understood why. I picked Tybura, and it was obviously the good pick because Tybura won, and I just don't understand why Denise was such a big favourite. He got absolutely demolished by Marcin Tybura, absolutely slashed up. Marcin Tybura was absolutely demolishing him with elbows. That would have gone an extra round that I don't think Denise would have been able to fight again, to be honest. And I understand why. He was on a big winning streak before the UFC. A lot of finishes. I understand why people were hyping him up, but not to beat Marcin Tybura. I mean, this dude had already shown that he's got terrible wrestling. He got nearly 10-8'd by Austin Lane, and Austin Lane's a low-level heavyweight as well, not even top 25 in the world right now. And even in his fight with Carl Williams, who we went to a decision with, Carl Williams was able to out-grapple him for a large majority of that fight as well. He got beaten and destroyed by Marcin Tybura. I think Derek Lewis would have beaten Denise when they were scheduled to fight. I think Shamil Gaziev probably absolutely mauls him with the wrestling. I think Mick Parkin can probably outclass him. Even Romanov can probably drown him and take him down. I know Romanov's been cut from the UFC, but theoretically, I think Romanov could probably beat him as well. I don't think the hype should have been there for Denise. He's got zero grappling, and he displayed it in literally every single UFC fight. He's been Tibura'd. He's a powerful, unathletic striker with nothing else, and I think he loses to any semi-decent heavyweight you put him against. So I'm going to say that Denise is the most overrated prospect to heavyweight. And for light heavyweight, there's not many light heavyweight prospects. There's only a handful. We've got the likes of Ming Yang Zhang, who recently won at UFC Macau, and Umar Sy, who won at UFC Paris. But I'd say the most underrated prospect is probably Vito Petrino. I think Vito Petrino was once a big prospect, and ever since his loss had been submitted by Anthony Smith, I understand losing to Smith in 2024 by finish is a bad thing, but he was fighting Smith, and he lost to Smith, and now everyone's kind of forgotten about Vito Petrino and the potential that he has. People are calling him a fraud, saying that he got fraud checked by Anthony Smith, and I guess you're not wrong, but I still see a lot of potential in Vito Petrino. I think he will be ranked one day, at least ranked in the top 15. And before the Anthony Smith fight, he was undefeated on a massive winning streak. The majority of those wins coming by way of finish as well. He's got scary KO power in the light heavyweight division. He's a solid submission artist, and he's in wrestling and improved massively in his last couple of fights. I mean, in his fight with Tyson Pedro, he completely mauled him the entire fight, retired him with wrestling. And you got to remember, he lost to Anthony Smith, and he's got 11 pro fights. Smith has got 57 pro fights. This is just a veteran going against a prospect, a more experienced guy going against a guy that is completely inexperienced in the UFC. He's going to be facing Dustin Jacoby next, and I think he runs through Dustin Jacoby, and I think he mixes it up well and probably beats him as well. So I'm going to say that Vito Petrino still has lots of potential, very good grappling, dangerous power on the feet, and he ran into a man with 10 times the experience, and he lost via mistake because he was out striking Anthony Smith as well previous to the finish. So I'm going to say that Vito Petrino is the most underrated prospect to light heavyweight, and the most overrated, I'm going Bogdan Guskov. I think Bogdan Guskov is getting a lot of hype for this next big prospect at light heavyweight, and I'm really not seeing it. Like, I get it, he's... From what we've seen in the UFC and outside the UFC, very, very powerful, very, very dangerous. Literally every single one of his wins have come by way of finish. I understand it. Debuts in the UFC with a knock. Well, didn't debut in the UFC, but he's had multiple knockout wins in the UFC. Knocked out Ryan Spann as well. I get it. He also got finished by Volkan Oezdemir in his UFC debut by submission against Oezdemir, who's a striker. And even on the feet, he was getting tagged by Volkan Oezdemir. It wasn't even like he was beating Oezdemir on the feet. Oezdemir was landing the better shots on the feet. And then when he decided to take him down, he just carried him up, picked him down, and submitted him. Even Ryan Spann was able to out-grapple Guskov before the finish, and even he was landing the most significant strikes before eventually Guskov got the finishing shot. And even when he fought Poirier as well, Poirier was landing a lot of good strikes on the feet, and he's going to be taking on Johnny Walker soon, I think UFC 311, and I am picking him to win Johnny Walker because Johnny Walker is probably the most chinny fighter in the UFC right now, but it wouldn't surprise me if Johnny Walker can go out there and just outstrike him for the majority of the fight, because I feel like the whole story of every Bogdan Guskov fight is that he loses the entire fight and then pulls off a finish later on in the fight, and I feel like as he gets closer to the more dangerous light heavyweights, you can't really rely on that anymore. He's terrible defensively. He gets hit a lot in every fight, bad takedown defense, like I said, usually loses the fight and finds a lucky shot, and he's basically Marcin Tybura but without the grappling and a little bit more power. That's the best way you can describe the style, in my opinion, of Bogdan Guskov. I think he's overrated. Not saying he's not dangerous or he doesn't deserve to be ranked, but I don't think he's I don't think he's anywhere near to be the next big thing at light heavyweight. And then the middleweight division. I'd say the middleweight division is probably the division with the most prospects in the UFC. There are so many prospects right now, so many up-and-comers in the middleweight division, and I'd say the most underrated one of all of them is Ikram Aliskerov. A similar situation to the Vito Petrino situation. Previous to the Whittaker loss, people were saying that Ikram Aliskerov is the most unbeatable man in the middleweight division. This guy with scary KO power, who's running through everybody, the next big thing in the UFC, and then he gets scheduled to fight Whittaker, who is a top 3 middleweight of all time, on 10 days notice, might even have been less than 10 days notice. And Whittaker beats him, Whittaker knocks him out, and because Whittaker's gone out there and knocked out Ikram Aliskerov, people have now completely forgotten about the hype and the potential that Ikram Aliskerov has. This dude's still very scary on the feet, carries a ton of power, very good at setting up big shots on the feet, and his grappling's even more dangerous. He's a very good submission artist, he's a very high-level grappler, and his only 2 losses in MMA is to Chimaev, who's a title contender, and Robert Whittaker, who's a top 5 middleweight in the world right now, top 3 greatest of all time. I think he's better than Bo Nickel, I think he's better than Roman Kopylov, I think he'd beat Shariputta Magomedov as well, who's now ranked as well. I think he beats all of those guys, and I just don't really think he's getting the hype for it. I reckon he will get in the top 10 of the middleweight division one day. Not saying he's going to be a future champion or anything like that, but I think he will make it into the top 10, and I think Ikram Aliskerov's underrated now. Still one of the best middleweight prospects. He's only lost to Whittaker and Chimaev. I wouldn't say that's fraud checked, and he still beats 95%, if not all unranked middleweights right now. So I'm saying that Ikram Aliskerov's underrated. And the most overrated, based on his recent performance, I'm going to go Bo Nickel. I'm not just trying to follow the crowd and go with Bo Nickel because he wasn't able to finish Paul Craig, but he's a literal can crusher, and I get it. He's got some of the best wrestling in the UFC, very high level wrestling, one of the best in the UFC, comes from a wrestling background. I understand. If we even look at his MMA career or his UFC career so far, though, I mean, he came from the Contender Series, beating a guy that's 6-5, but to be fair, that's to be expected on the Contender Series. Got another win in the Contender Series as well by finish against somebody that's 8-4. Then he gets a main card opportunity at UFC 285 on the John Jones comeback card. Talk about privilege. Gets to fight Jamie Pickett, knees him in the balls to get the takedown, and then when he takes him down, he gets the submission over him. And that's Jamie Pickett, who's 13-11 as a professional. Not a super impressive win. Then he gets a main card opportunity at UFC 290, again very gifted, against Val Woodburn, a Gardner. Knocks out Val Woodburn in the first round. That was quite impressive, to be fair. And then he fights on UFC 300, arguably the greatest card of all time. He gets a main card opportunity with only 5 fights against Cody Brundage. Cody Brundage was mocking him in that first round because he wasn't able to really do anything. Then he finishes him in the second against 10-6 Cody Brundage, who in my opinion shouldn't really be UFC worthy anymore. And then in his most recent fight, he was barely able to outstrike one of the worst middleweight strikers against Paul Craig and was too scared to take it to the ground. I don't think he's a big prospect in the middleweight division. Maybe he can become ranked if you put him against like Michelle Pereira or Sharon Magomedov, a favourable matchup, but apart from that, I don't think there's many ranked middleweights that I would pick Bo Nickel to win against. He's a can crusher. He couldn't even dominantly outstrike Paul Craig, and he was too scared to take it to the mat. And the UFC are promoting this guy as the next big thing. I really don't see. This guy isn't giving me the same vibes that Chimaev was giving me when Chimaev was on his come up. If you put Chimaev on his come up against current Paul Craig, he's probably knocking him out within the first round. If not, he takes him to the ground and mauls him. Bo Nickel wasn't showing that. He barely got by Paul Craig. So I'm going to say that Bo Nickel's the most overrated prospect at the middleweight. And then for the welterweight division, another division that has a lot of prospects, a lot of guys in the come up, a lot of dangerous guys in the welterweight division. The most underrated prospect at welterweight, in my opinion, is Oban Elliott. I used to be on the Oban Elliott, not the hatred of Oban Elliott, but I used to think he was a little bit overrated. But now that you look at his UFC career so far, I've kind of gone around the circle. I kind of think he's a bit underrated these days. There's a lot of prospects at welterweight, and I'd say Oban Elliott's right at the back of the queue. No one's really paying attention to him. He's not really getting any eyes on him. And I understand why. He's a bit of a decision machine, he's Oban Elliott. 50% of his wins come by way of decision, but he's on a massive winning streak right now in MMA. Since 2022, this dude's been on an absolute tear, a massive winning streak, and I think he's kind of overlooked. He starts off his UFC career by beating Val Woodburn, basically dominates Val Woodburn the entire fight with his wrestling, does it in impressive fashion. Then he fights Preston Parsons, who is a fairly solid submission artist, is Preston Parsons. 9 wins by submission. And he out-grapples him as well. Out-grapples the submission artist for the majority of the fight. Shows very dominant grappling. And even on the feet, he was showing that he's got not only good stamina, but he was out-striking Preston Parsons too. And then he fights Basil Hafez in his most recent fight. Basil Hafez went life and death with Jack Della Maddalena. A lot of people actually thought Basil Hafez beat JDM, which just shows how tough that guy is. And then he beats Mickey Gall. And Oban Elliott goes against that guy, knocks him out cold in the 3rd round as well, brutally recently at UFC 309 after beating him on the feet anyway. And I think for Oban Elliott, he's not really flashy. He's not a guy that gets a ton of finishes, so he doesn't really get the attention. But when you look at it from a potential perspective, he's got a lot of potential. He's a solid grappler, great stamina, and apparently now he's dangerous on the feet, as he just showcased by, putting Basil Hafez into next week. So I think Oban Elliott is quite an underrated prospect. And for overrated, this might sound crazy, but I'm going to go Michael Morales. I think Marco Morales is just a tad bit overrated in the UFC. He's undefeated, 17-0, so he's got a lot of hype, and he's now number 12 in the welterweight division, which I think is crazy. A win over Neil Magny, you're number 12. I think that's quite a big step up for Marco Morales in the rankings, and he's had a couple of good finishes to start off his UFC career. Showed that he's got dangerous striking. Ran into Griffin as well, Max Griffin, and Max Griffin was giving him a lot of problems with the grappling. And then he fights Jake Matthews, a heavy grappler, and I'm not going to say he wasn't winning the fight. He was winning the fight, but first of all, he was way bigger in that fight than Jake Matthews. He's a bit of a weight bully, and Jake Matthews was making it competitive on the feet. And then he fights Neil Magny. Neil Magny out-grapples him for the first half of the first round, and then he ends up getting finished by Marco Morales. But I just don't really see the crazy hype from this guy. I think Jeff Neal, I think Carlos Pratas, I think MVP could probably all beat this guy on the feet. And I think maybe not MVP, but I think at least Pratas and Jeff Neal could beat this guy on the feet, school him on the feet. And like I said, even Neil Magny was able to out-grapple him. If that's what Neil Magny's doing to Marco Morales, imagine what happens when you put him against one of the top welterweight grapplers as well. So even though I think he deserves to be ranked, and I'm not saying he's not a good fighter, he's a weight bully. He should be fighting at 185. Barely got past Jake Matthews. He's got amateur grappling, and he's a solid fighter, but I don't think he's the future of the welterweight division. There's a lot of welterweight prospects coming in, like a Carlos Prates, that I see a lot more potential in than a Marco Morales. So I'm going to say that he's a little bit overrated at welterweight. And then for the lightweight division, a lot of good lightweight prospects. It just shows how competitive the lightweight division is, that some of the best unranked lightweights would definitely be ranked in any other division. It's full of killers, but I'd say the most underrated prospect is probably Fares Ziam. I think Fares Ziam is kind of underrated as well. 16-4 as a professional, so a lot of people don't really give him the credit, and he has lost twice in the UFC, got finished by Terence McKinney and lost his UFC debut. But apart from that, he's had a lot of good moments in the UFC. People kind of see him as a bit of a decision machine, at least before his most recent fight, and I was kind of on that hype too. I saw him as a bit of a decision machine. He's not really going to do well when you put him against a top opponent, but you really look at his UFC career and the guys that he's beaten. He's got very high level grappling. He uses grappling very effectively. Great judo, great ground and pound, and he was recently scheduled to fight one of the most dangerous unranked lightweights in Matt Frivola, and he dominates him on the feet for the entire fight, dominates him with the grappling the entire fight, and ends it off by getting a potential KO of the year contender by knocking him out in a brutal knockout, one of the best knockouts this year. And I'd say he's probably got more potential than Benoit Saint that he's had. Maybe that's a crazy statement. Maybe not as far as excitement and finishing ability goes, but at least he had a better performance against Matt Frivola than Benoit Saint that he's did, in my opinion. He's a high-level grappler with dangerous striking. Nobody's talked about him, but I think he's better than Benoit Saint that he's. He just brutalized Matt Frivola after dominating the entire fight. I say we give Fares Ziam a ranked fight now. Maybe like a Jalin Turner or someone who's coming off a loss in the lightweight rankings, but I think Feresiam is underrated at lightweight and overrated in the division. I don't think he's overrated. It was kind of hard to go with. I'm going to go with Ludovic Klein. I think he's probably the least promising prospect in the lightweight division. I was originally going to go with Orobai, but then after Orobai's most recent performance, I feel like tying him to the word overrated is the last thing you can do. But I'm going to go with Ludovic Klein as like the least promising prospect. I mean, in the lightweight division, he's looked pretty good so far. He hasn't lost so far in the UFC in the lightweight division. He's had a draw with Jai Herbert. He's had a couple of decision wins against guys that he probably should be beating against some of these lower level fighters. And going to a draw with Jai Herbert and actually suffering on the ground with him a little bit is never a good look, because Jai Herbert is not a top lightweight by any means. So going to a draw with him is never a good look when you're meant to be a prospect. And since then, he's gone 4-0 in the UFC with a finish. But his most recent fight against Roosevelt Roberts going into that fight was 0-4 in his last 4. And every single one of those losses were coming by way of finish as well. He was meant to go out there and destroy him, and he takes him to a decision. A fairly competitive decision is never a good look for Ludovic Klein, so he's not really overrated, but I think he's the least promising prospect. He's making a close fight out of people he should be destroying, and he's a solid fighter, but I don't think he's ever going to be ranked. So I'm going to go with Ludovic Klein for lightweight. And then for the featherweight division, the most underrated prospect at featherweight, I'm going Yoanderson Brito. If you've been on this channel for a while, you'll see that I keep bringing up Yoanderson Brito, and I think it's for good reason. Look at what this dude has done in the UFC so far. He's beaten Diego Lopez, one of the best featherweights in the world, on the Contender Series. He's knocked out Andre Fili. He's submitted Jonathan Pierce. He's finished Jack Shaw, who was also once a big prospect in the first round. And that's not even to mention the other 2 first-round finishes he's got in the UFC. And his only losses is a robbery loss to William Gomez. He recently fought William Gomez, in my opinion, dominated the fight, and he got robbed by the judges in Paris against a Frenchman. And then he has another decision loss earlier on in his UFC career. But I think he's one of the best unranked featherweights. He should be fighting a featherweight next, and I think he's the best unranked featherweight. Potentially, I'm not going to say, I know this is a bit of a bold claim, but potentially better than Gene Silver. Definitely, in my opinion, better than William Gomez anyway. He's one of the best, if not the best, unranked featherweights. He's got some amazing wins that go under the radar. The UFC aren't promoting this guy correctly, and he was robbed against William Gomez. He's a very good grappler, very good submission artist, very powerful on the feet as well. Able to keep that pace for 3 rounds. Yoanderson Brito is super underrated, in my opinion, in the featherweight division. And for overrated, I'm going with the guy he just got robbed against, William Gomez. It kind of pains me to think that William Gomez is probably going to be getting a ranked opportunity in his next fight. I hope he doesn't get a ranked opportunity. I know he's on a big winning streak, but it's a fraudulent winning streak when you really look at it. Like I said, his most recent win was a robbery win over Yoanderson Brito, where he was getting out-grappled the majority of the fight, and even on the feet, he wasn't dominantly beating him, and he got a robbery win that even he was surprised to see. And apart from that, he's finished Yanis Gamori, but Yanis Gamori is 0-2 by finishing the UFC. Bit of a can to give him and Talbot a 3-win. And he's a weight bully on top of that. He was scheduled to fight Gene Silver and pulled out last minute because he was too ill and he was too messed up, and he was literally dying on the weighing scales, which just shows that he should not be fighting at 145. He should be at 155, which makes things worse. He's also lost to Morgan Sherreri as well. Before the UFC on the regional scene, which Morgan Sherreri is also a rise in the UFC. And I get it, he's a good striker, is William Gomez. He's a pretty solid striker, but I don't think he should be getting the hype that he's getting. I don't think he should be classed as a big prospect. He's a weight bully. He robbed Yoanderson Brito, very one-dimensional, and he's on a fraudulent winning streak as well. I hope he doesn't get a ranked opportunity his next fight. I hope the UFC treat it as if Yoanderson Brito won that fight, and I think William Gomez, he's an overrated featherweight prospect. And then for the bantamweight division, the most underrated bantamweight is Marcus McGee. I think he's underrated. He's not ranked number 14th right now in the bantamweight division, and nobody's really paying attention to him. I get it, people have been calling him a prospect, but people are kind of treating this guy as if he's just the next Jonathan Martinez, and I think he's got more potential than Batista. I think he's got more potential than Kyler Phillips. Obviously, I think he has more potential than Jonathan Martinez, who he recently beat. He's an absolute machine as well. That win over Jonathan Martinez was his only decision win in his entire career. Apart from that, he had 8 KOs and 1 submission. 4-0 in the UFC, 3 of them coming by way of finish as well. And what impresses me about Marcus McGee is he's good everywhere the fight goes. He was able to stand with Jonathan Martinez and kind of win it from a technical standpoint against a very technical striker in Jonathan Martinez, which is quite impressive. On top of that, he's got KO ability. He's KO'd his other opponents in the UFC. KO'd Bolanos, which is good because Bolanos, as he showed in his last fight, is a very high-level striker. And he's also got grappling ability. He likes to mix it up with the wrestling very well. He's a good submission artist as well. He's got everything as Marcus McGee. He does well at mixing in the grappling, scary KO power, solid technique on the feet, tons of potential in the UFC does Marcus McGee, so I think he can climb the rankings. If we're going to give Jose Aldo a prospect, why are we giving Jose Aldo Mario Batista? Give him somebody like Marcus McGee, who's very dangerous, very exciting on the feet. isn't going to hold him against the cage for 3 rounds straight. He's going to make it a scrap as well. So I think Marcus McGee's kind of going under the radar. People should be hyping him up a little bit more for what he's done in the UFC so far. And for the most overrated prospect, I'm going to go with Raul Rosas Jr. He's a massive star, and for the wrong reasons. He's only been hyped up because he's young, and he's 20 years old, and he debuted in the Contender Series at 17, which is impressive, as I'm not going to deny it's impressive. But why is he getting so much hype? And because of his chewy thing that he does, which was never funny. I'm not trying to be one of these mood killers, but it was never funny. He dreams of being the youngest UFC champion. By 25 years old, he wants to retire as well. I don't even think he makes it into the bantamweight rankings. Never mind being a champion. If you look at his UFC career so far, he debuts against Jay Perry in a complete can, gets a finish. Then he faces Christian Rodriguez, who isn't by any means a high-level bantamweight, and loses dominantly to Christian Rodriguez in the ground game where he was supposed to be favoured the entire fight. Arguably, you can say he got fraud-checked in that fight. Then he knocked out Terrence Mitchell, who's 0-2 in the UFC by first round knockout anyway, which isn't that impressive. And he's on a 2-fight winning streak, but his opponents have a combined UFC record of 5-6. So not only are they inexperienced in the UFC, but they've got more losses than they have wins combined. And even in his most recent win as well, he went toe-to-toe as well. He should be running through these guys, and he's going toe-to-toe with them, and he won a fairly, not a close decision, but he won a decision where it wasn't super dominant, and then he called for 50 Gs. I think Raul Rosas Jr., he's a good personality to have in the bantamweight division, and the fact that he's the youngest fighter of all time is impressive, but he's not hyped because of his skill. It's because of his age. He's barely getting by guys he should be running through. He's a fun guy, but you put this dude against pretty much any single ranked fighter in the UFC and he gets finished or he gets starched. I don't think he ever becomes ranked, never mind even becoming a top fighter in the bantamweight division. And then for the flyweight division, the most underrated prospect is Ramazan Temirov. Flyweight's got not the biggest roster, not the biggest talent pool, but I think Ramazan Temirov's quite underrated. He's got a record of 18-2, comes from Kazakhstan, great record, and he's on a massive winning streak as well in MMA. All of his most recent 4 fights have all come by way of finish as well. He debuted against CJ Vajera, a pretty decent opponent to debut against, and he just walloped him the entire fight, dropped him, was battering him against the cage, got the finish in the first round by KO, and I think he's very dangerous. He's super dangerous on the feet, absolute killer as well. You put this dude like against Azu Almabayev, unless Azu Almabayev keeps him on the mat for the entire fight, he probably chins him too, and he's meant to be the next prospect as well. He's Almabayev, and he should be getting a ranked opportunity soon. I know he's only had 1 win in the UFC, but 18-2. Dangerous striker, just finished CJ Vajera brutally as well. Give him a ranked fighter, give him like a Cody Durden or one of these ranked flyweights as well. I think he deserves that. And then for the most overrated prospect at flyweight, I'm going Ronaldo Rodriguez. I don't know why he's such a big star in Mexico. 1.7 million followers on Instagram. That's more than Tom Aspinall. He fought on the Contender Series as well. Lost on the Contender Series, which is never a bad start when you can't even get past the regional scene of the Contender Series. Then he gets a submission win against a dude that was 0-3 in the UFC just 0-3 in the UFC. And then he fights Odi Osbourne as well. Odi Osbourne was a second away from finishing him in that first round, and I think that fight should have been a draw because he nearly got chinned by Odi Osbourne. And Odi Osbourne, by the way, is 4-5 in it. 1-4 in his last 5 fights. And before Ronaldo Rodriguez, he'd been finishing all those losses too, so it wasn't that impressive. And he went toe-to-toe with him. I don't think Ronaldo Rodriguez is a top fighter. He lost on the Contender Series and was like a second away from getting finished by Odi Osbourne. I don't think he should have so much hype. He's never going to be a top-ranked fighter, in my opinion. Feed him to Joshua Fan and get it over and done with. But that is, in my opinion, the most overrated and underrated prospect in every division in the UFC. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Thank you for watching.